Hello everybody, we're carrying on with where we left off in the previous lecture, which is still the origins of World War I, the different levels. Now, the actual name World War I was coined by a Times correspondent, so somebody who wrote for a newspaper, Charles Court Repington. He came up with the actual phrase, the First World War, in a book by 1920, even though it was actually first used by a German philosopher, Ernst Haeckel, in 1914. Charles Court Repington is the one that it's attributed to. Now, alliances form quite an important part of the causes of World War I. Before this, in Europe, between 1815 and 1870, there was quite loose multipolarity. That is in Europe. But between 1870 and 1907, you saw an increase in the bipolarity of alliances. Now, as alliances build, it makes the situation more tense and uneasy, and also creates a security dilemma, which is exactly what happened in Europe previously. The First World War was quite a big deal, killed over 15 million people. And if we actually start at the systems level of analysis, we'll see that structurally, the rise of German power helped to lead to increased rigidity in the alliance system. What that means basically is that by 1913, Germany had 15% of the world's industrial production in its own power. Britain at that point only had 10%. There was also an idea by Alfred von Tirpitz, known as the Tirpitz Plan in 1911, who was part of the German Navy, to build the second largest navy in the world. That signaled the rise of German power in Europe and created a kind of threatening feeling for its neighbors. This, as well as the increased rigidity in the alliance system, for example, Britain and France created an alliance in 1904. In 1907, there was an Anglo-French and Russian alliance. That's now the Triple Entente I spoke about in the previous lecture. And in response to that, Germany tightened its relations with Austria-Hungary. So there was quite a lot of rigidity, and the flexibility that the loose multipolarity had provided before 1870 in Europe was gone. And now it was much more concentrated, tight, these alliances, tightly wrapped, these two poles. There was also the rising idea of nationalism, complacency about peace. In other words, there will always be peace, people assumed, in Europe because the strong would always prevail. It's a kind of social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest. German policy was also very vague and confusing, which irritated Britain, especially its German naval build-up, which was a kind of threatening stance taken by Germany against England. German policy also irritated Russia over its involvement in Turkey and the Balkans. It also irritated France over its involvement in Morocco. And there was a point where Sir Eyre Crowe, who was the permanent secretary of British foreign policy in 1907, argued or suggested that the lights were going out across Europe. He was saying basically that he could see that there was going to be a war, that something was building up to a war. So that's all part of structure and process at the systems level of analysis. You can see all of this fully in Nye's text. But what was happening at the state level, in other words, in terms of domestic politics? Well, there was basically an international crisis arising as a result of a decline in the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. Both of these empires were threatened by nationalism, and so there was splintering. That, as well as the domestic situation in Germany, helped lead to World War I. Austria basically feared the disintegration of its empire because of the nationalism, and the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was a pretext to war. Domestically within Germany, it was experiencing many social problems. For example, debates around the landed aristocrats and the industrialists joined up in forming the coalition of rye and iron. There were also problems around how would we deal with social democracies and the best way to placate the ordinary citizens would be to expand and take over other territory. You really need to look at this more in depth in the textbook. At the individual level of analysis, you'll see that there was a kind of mediocre leadership across Europe. Franz Joseph, who was the leader of Austria at the time, was a very tired old man. I've already explained a little bit about the insecurity that Kaiser Wilhelm grew up with and embodied him as a leader. He had a huge inferiority complex. He sent a postcard to his uncle Edward VII, who was the King of England at the time, and in it the Kaiser was dressed in Scottish regalia, in a kilt, and had a sporran, etc. And in that he wrote, "I bide my time." Now, Edward VII was actually his uncle, so he was really threatening his own family member. So you might say that deep causes of World War I could be those that seem to be the most remote, systems level and domestic level, like nationalism. The intermediate causes of war could be, for example, German policy, which irritated Russia, France, and Britain, peace complacency amongst normal people, and the leaders themselves who were mediocre across Europe. And then precipitating causes could be immediately before the war, obviously the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. That would be seen as the striking of the match. So we have to ask ourselves as a final question, was World War I probable? It was probable, but not inevitable. In other words, human choice still mattered. If you can believe it, World War I actually did come as a shock, and the leaders at the time didn't really want it to happen. What the Kaiser commented on was a telegram where he said that England, Russia, and France had basically taken it upon themselves to destroy Germany, and therefore Germany had to respond and basically take on this balance of power in Europe. So he basically suggested that Germany had no other recourse but to go to war. Of course, this is not necessarily the case, but it depends on your point of view. And you can have a look at many other different sources if you'd like to figure out what the causes of World War I were, and especially in your own opinion. Some of World War I firsts were that it was the first war to be fought on 3 continents. It was the first actual industrialized conflict. It was the first time chlorine and mustard gas were used in conflicts, and the first time the flamethrower was used as a weapon of war. It was the first war that involved tank battles and the use of mass airplanes. It was also the first use of a blood bank during this war, and the use of guide dogs by blind soldiers, and the first use of the word trillion in estimating war costs. And while in office, Woodrow Wilson was the first president to actually visit, the first US president to actually visit a European country on the 12th of April, 1918. So those are some basic fun facts about World War I, but just to remind you, this is quite an important lecture, both of these 2 that I've just given now, for the exam. So make sure you definitely know your facts and details around the origins of World War I and be able to explain these 3 different levels or causes. How might you apply Waltz's images to the origins of World War I? What is power? How has power changed in terms of the conventional definition and understanding of power? And how did the alliance system, political leadership, and military doctrines prior to World War I lead to that war? What other factors might have led to that conflict? And do you think that World War I was inevitable? Remember, we like to argue that it was probable, but not inevitable. Human choices still mattered. And if you use counterfactual analysis, you can go back in history and say, if Kaiser Wilhelm was a better person or was not born with a withered arm, do you think he would have had such a security complex that he would have been pivotal, in creating the events leading to World War I? Those kinds of questions will definitely feature in an exam situation. Please feel free to come and talk to me about this if you want to, or talk to each other if you'd like to about this on the discussion forum on Ulink. It's completely up to you. But please let me know if there's anything here you don't understand or would like more clarity on. Thank you, guys. See you on the 29th.